Welcome back to Advent Next, a theological podcast for curious faith discussions. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, check out our discussion with Dr. Trevor OReggio on the history of African Christianity and the contributions of African intellectualism to Western theology. Moving forward through history, we're continuing our discussion with Dr. OReggio on the African American religious experience. We also end our show today with a special guest appearance from Andrew Ashley, the director and producer of the documentary The Wound. If you're not already following us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, you can find us at the handle @AdventNext. My co-host today is once again Michelle Odinma. You can follow her at Michelle Odinma Music. And as always, I'm your host, Kendra Arsenal, and this is Advent Next.
So one of the great contributions that Black scholars have made to what we call Christian theology is their reflection on the meaning of slavery, the meaning of suffering and pain. So as I said, what the Black slaves did is they took elements of their African past, they took elements of this new religion brought by the whites, and they recalibrated and they essentially remade it into what we now call the African American religious experience. It was a religious experience deeply rooted in suffering, in pain, but if you notice, many of the great spirituals that we know are rooted in these deep, profound human emotions.
Right.
Yeah.
The spirit of the song, you could sense it coming through. But in the midst of all of this, these African American worshipers always believe that ultimately they're going to triumph. God was with them, walking through the valley of the shadow of death. There's a famous spiritual which talks about you got shoes, he got shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes, because at that time the slaves didn't have any shoes.
Wow.
But they had the faith to believe that ultimately
One day.
they were going to experience all of the privileges and the resources that were now available to their white counterpart in America. And so when you look at these songs, so the power of their experience is rooted in those songs that they sing. And also if you hear the sermons that are preached, the Black sermon has a definitive form to it. It's a form in which the Black sees himself in the sermon. The preacher, it's a narrative form, it's a story form, and it's expressive, it's painful at the same time, joyful. It has a mix of all of these emotions.
Yeah.
And also, one of the features of this Black worship or Black preaching is what I call commentary on the present situation, what we call commentary on social justice.
Yeah.
They believe that it was not simply enough to look forward to heaven, but to also speak to the prevailing injustice in which they found themselves in.
And I think that's something we struggle with even as a church today.
Yeah.
People see social justice as something that it's taking away from the gospel, but they didn't see
Oh,
that.
absolutely not.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that the Black church was the center of Black life.
Right.
It happened there. Everything happened there. It was a library. It was where they met to discuss issues. Because remember now, they were excluded from many of the state institutions. So the Black church was the heart of Black life. And it continues to be, to some degree, in many Black communities.
Wow. There's I was reading some history, and there's a guy named Grimke. Again, he was mixed race. His father was white, and his mother was African American. And he really believed that one day, if we just all kind of, come under the unity of Christ, and when we can become one brotherhood, and we wouldn't need all of this complexity of social justice. He really believed that Jesus would be the answer. Is it that simple? Why or why not? Like, is that just what we need as a church, just to come together, or is there a need for social justice initiatives?
Okay. Well, the situation is a lot more complicated than that, because remember now, the Black church or the church in America is also in a particular cultural and historic context that it finds itself in right here. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, has the American nation ever confronted the horrendous evil of slavery
Yeah.
and the persistent evil of racism?
Yeah.
Right.
And they're not the same thing. Racism is an ideology that is very much alive. It has reconfigured itself over time. And so we know from Christianity that a person cannot address issues of reconciliation and forgiveness unless, first of all, they acknowledge
Sure.
that they have committed a wrong.
Yeah.
Has America ever acknowledged that? I doubt it. They must then confess
Right.
their wrongs, and then they have to repent.
Yeah.
These are the steps: acknowledgement,
Yeah.
confession, and repentance. That has never really been done either by the American nation or the white, what I call Christian church in America. Some of them have issued apologies. These things have to happen first before we get to reconciliation.
Sure.
You see, you can't really be forgiven of a sin that you don't think you committed.
Right.
And we see even in the church, a divide between black church and white church, even today in America. And some people say, well, this divide or different conferences, that people say, no, like, we should all just be one church. Like, do you feel like there's still a necessity for that separation? Or is it something that, oh, no, we're ready to come together?
Well, I'll answer this question this way. The formation of the black church was not because blacks necessarily wanted to form their own church.
Sure.
Right.
It grew out of a situation where they were being excluded from white churches, number one, or while they were in the white church, they were being segregated. So they were being excluded or segregated by white churches. And so this created the necessity for the formation of a black church. I think if you talk to most black Christians, they're open to all races.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think black people have come to recognize that ultimately their interests can only be served by their own leaders.
Yeah.
If history is any guide, if we look at the last history of America, if you simply leave it up to concerned whites,
Yeah.
to be concerned about your own interests, it's never going to happen.
Sure.
So blacks understand that they have to take the initiative for their own welfare, their own spiritual well-being. And so because of that, I see the continual necessity of black leadership, black churches, and so forth. Until the great revival come and the Spirit makes us all one, we will continue down this road, unfortunately. Ultimately, blacks, in order to have to really move their work the way it should be, it essentially has to be done by black leadership.
Yeah, and you had mentioned, like, even in Adventism, our first missionary that we sent to Europe.
Yeah.
When we have in the South, we have a ton of slaves who could use ministering to, but we don't. That's not our first thought as Adventists.
Yes. This is interesting. In the early beginnings of Adventism, in 1874, I think we sent our first official missionary, J.N. Andrews, for whom this university is named after. He went to Christian Switzerland. But what was happening in America? We had almost 3 million black slaves in the South who needed everything.
Yeah.
They needed education. They needed Christ. They needed the gospel. Now, there were some groups that were sending down missionaries essentially to the South.
That the Quakers?
But there are Methodists. There's several other groups, and they went there, established colleges for these poor. Remember now, they had just come out of 244 years of slavery.
Right.
They had nothing, no resources. They were uneducated, unrefined. They needed everything. And what do we do as Adventists? We send a missionary to Europe.
Wow.
It shows the lack of vision that we had of the great need. And in fact, if it were not for our prophet, Ellen White, who actually stood up and strongly encouraged the leadership to send someone to the South, even with that, they didn't. It was her son who took up the challenge and went there, and his own initiative. It shows how, it seems as if our priorities were in the wrong place. Yeah.
So how do we, kind of move forward from here in our modern context with, white Christians thinking that, okay, we can all bridge together now. We kind of talked about it. Yeah. And then black people, continuing with, we need black churches. Is there any way, and Kendra kind of alluded to it, that we can come together, or do we still need...
Okay. Well, I think that on the church level, outside of the leadership level, on the church level, I think that groups of sincere black and white Christians need to start coming together and talking to each other about what's going on, having meaningful, ongoing dialogue about their situations. Let's get to know each other better.
Sure.
Being an immigrant myself, I've sometimes able to take myself out of the American situation, and I've identified two major problems here between black Christians. And white Christians. Some white Christians fail to acknowledge the wrong that has been inflicted on blacks historically in America. They don't want to deal with that. And of course, when it's brought up, it can create feelings of unease or even feelings of guilt. And people don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
That's the white Christian. But the black Christians themselves, I notice, also have, and this is just my own analysis of the situation, there's a lot of anger that comes up. And so on one hand, we have one group that doesn't want to acknowledge what has happened and sometimes feeling very guilty about it. We have another group that's very angry, and sometimes the anger is so intense that it doesn't create an atmosphere for meaningful dialogue.
Sure.
So where do we go from there? Here. So I would suggest that both groups need to do something.
Right.
White Christians need to, prayerfully acknowledge, confess, and repent what has been done to blacks, and willing to talk about it.
So
Without any feelings of guilt or anything.
sure.
Well, let me finish. And the black Christians, on the other hand, need to find a way of channeling the anger that they sometimes feel in more meaningful and productive ways so that some good can come out of all of this. And once we kind of reach a kind of equilibrium between two groups, I think we can see the way forward for reconciliation and peace between the groups.
Sure. And I'm wondering the unity between, so you had abolitionists, right? And during the time of slavery, and you had white abolitionists, obviously black abolitionists. Do you think that now white Christians combining or unifying with black people to push this message of reconciliation and, forgiveness and wholeness is advantageous to communicate to other white Christians this message? We need to unify on this platform.
Yes, I think the big issue is perhaps who's going to take the initiative to do this and who's going to sustain it to its ultimate end or ultimate outcome.
Yeah.
There have been attempts made by various groups of Christians, both blacks and whites, over the years, but I'm not sure how sustainable it has been. Ultimately, for me, I think that it's never really going to happen in its fullness until revival comes. When the Spirit comes in His fullness and He's able to break down all of the walls that separate us, I think we will begin to see our brothers and sisters, whatever their color and race, as part of the same family. But it's going to require a lot of prayer, fasting. But the revival, I think, is something that we need to be praying for. But on the other hand, we should be doing everything humanly possible to bring it about.
Something that you mentioned that is sticking with me and it stays in my head, that kind of greed can blind you, or self-interest blinded the early white Christians to the injustice that they were doing to their black brethren. And I think about how even on the global scale today, it still happens, that people enter into business ventures where there's human trafficking all over the world. People are being paid very, very low wages. I mean, we don't often think about our personal effect and the way that our purchase power or our companies or whatever it is that we're vested in, how it affects and can oppress and how we are contributing to other systems of oppression. And my question to you is how conscious should we be even in all of our actions today, and ways that we cannot make maybe the same mistakes that early white Christians made towards their brethren?
I think that sometimes we become blinded to our own pain, our own little world in which we live. But the issues that you have just raised go beyond just black oppression in America. There's evil in the world all over. And I think that we should be concerned about injustice anywhere. Yeah. What did Martin Luther says? Injustice what? Anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Yeah. So by being global in our concerns, we have sex trafficking, we have the abuse of women, we have slavery all over, we have the abuse of workers. Our issues also connects with these because it is the exploitations of human beings all over the world. And I think as spiritual leaders, we have a duty and the responsibility to speak to these evils wherever they are.
I'm thinking, and I feel like so as Christians, one mission that God has allowed us to be a part of, his mission is reaching out to other people and fighting for the oppressed and justice. And I think personally the connection I make is the lack of service that we sometimes do, or that Christians sometimes do, narrows their mind to understanding these other difficulties, these other obstacles, and the history behind the hurt and the suffering. So what do you think about that? The lack of service kind of closes our eyes to other things going on. We're not able to sympathize or understand or connect.
Well, I'll give you, this community is a good example. Barron Springs is close to one of the poorest towns in all of Michigan. You could live in Barron Spring in your little cocoon here, your little Adventist cocoon, and have no idea of the tremendous deprivation that's taking place in Benton Harbor.
Yeah.
So I think if we follow the model of Jesus, where he went and he visited with the poor and the outcast and the disenfranchised, then we're able to have the capacity to be compassionate towards them. But if we're content to simply stay within our own environment, we will never be aware of these particular issues. And I think this is a big problem with Adventists all over. We are not as connected with our surrounding communities and aware of the issues that they're facing as we should be. Yeah.
So what would you like to kind of end this program on? We went through a wide sweep of kind of looking at the non-Western history of Christianity, the African history of Christianity, their contribution to the Western intellectualism that we have today, understandings of the Trinity and all that, and then how that, the Black experience, religious experience in America. What would you like to say to kind of maybe summarize it, or any kind of points?
Well, I would say that our capacity for influencing the world is directly related to how united we are as a people, especially across the color line. When the world sees Black Christians and white Christians joining hands together, worshiping together, doing service together, that becomes a convincing argument to them that there may be something about Christianity.
Right.
So for me, this is a divine imperative. It's a necessity for us. If we want to convince the world, if we want to convince the atheists and the non-believers of the genuineness of our faith, it's only going to happen. Right now, some of them are laughing at us because they say, why would I want to join an organization where people are living separately, because of their skin color or their cultural views? I think the impact of the early church was based directly on that. When the world saw how united this group of people were, regardless of their culture, their language, their race, when they saw this power of unity that was experienced among the early church. If you recall in the book of Acts, it tells us that they would sell their goods and give to those who didn't have any. There was this spirit of love that pervaded the community of faith. And that becomes a powerful magnet to draw people to the faith. And so right now our faith is being blunted because of what's happening among us. But when we come together under one umbrella, under one banner, I think that our impact will be very consequential.
Yeah. And it's coming from someone who is mixed race. Like I see the importance of listening, and really understanding someone's side, and I think that the actionable thing somebody can walk away with today is say, how do we listen to the pain and hurt of others? And then if there's something that I can do, whether it's acknowledging that, whether it's if I have ownership in that, to apologize, but to create that space for those dialogues to happen, it's so important and so key for us to move forward.
listening is one of the best forms of demonstrating love.
Yes. Thank you so much for being on our show today. Michelle, you have any last questions or comments you'd like to?
I do have another question, but I don't know if we should reopen it back. Or,
Please, just do.
Just watching the recent case of the police officer that accidentally, shot her neighbor, and just looking at the news about it, a comment was made that Black people seem to always be the ones forgiving, or always be the ones that have to forgive. And what do you think about that for the Black Christian, for the Black American experience? Do you agree with that, or do you think it's necessary?
Well, unfortunately, historically, Black people seem to be the ones that are primarily the victims. And in many cases, the victimizer doesn't extend forgiveness. It's the victim, unfortunately, who is sometimes called upon to initiate forgiveness. So I think you're dealing with a historic reality. But I think what grew out of that experience, though, was the beauty of that young man hugging that police officer. For me, it was such a painful experience to lose your brother, but then to actually reach across the aisles and embrace that police officer in a spirit of forgiveness. I think that the world saw a beautiful demonstration of what true Christianity is all about in that image. I walked away from it having a sense of hope, even though something tragic had happened.
So to end this episode, I wanted to bring on a special guest, Andrew Ashley, who is the director and producer of a documentary called The Wound, in which he investigates the history of race relations in the church, as well as what we are doing today to move the conversation forward. And so, I love what you've done with wanting to really spread some light on a specific topic. We just finished talking with Dr. Trevor OReggio, looking at the African American religious experience in America, going back from the time of slavery and looking at how, what did it mean to be both Black and Christian during the time of slavery? That here, you have the call of the gospel that's supposed to bring everyone under the same banner. Everyone is a sinner and everyone has salvation in Christ, and we are to be one family under God. But then the societal reality places you in a hierarchical position where it's now slave and master. And so looking at that tension, it's something that hasn't entirely gone away. And so, wanting to know kind of in your experience, what does that mean for you to be both Black and Christian in this society? But first, I just want you to start off with talking about your documentary, The Wound, and how you got started.
No. Well, once again, Kendra, thanks for having me. I love your work. I love what you're doing. And you're also a filmmaker, and you're doing a lot of cool stuff. So, I appreciate that. The project, The Wound, the documentary, that came out almost 2 years ago. Kind of the idea behind that was that at the time I was working at Adventist institution, Southern Adventist University, and I was working as a recruiter. And at that time, in the last year or so, our university, our campus, had experienced a lot of racial tension. There was a lot of different incidents that were happening. And one of the biggest questions was, and at least in the Black community, is like, man, how do we handle this? Because most of the Black students there, at least the community that I had, we were all Christians, right? And there was a lot of themes that we were thinking about when we think about conflict as Christians, like, forgiveness, being patient, listening, trying to resolve issues, not letting the sun go down on your wrath, all that good jazz. But at the same time, at being Black, really in America is such a, it's almost like a political statement, right? Because there's so much that comes with being Black even today in America. I think that one thing we struggle with as Christians, and there's a lot of people that you can have on that are experts in that area and they can speak to that. But one thing I was struggling with as a young Black man who also was a Christian was trying to figure out what was the best way to work with my white community to kind of resolve some of the tensions we had. I mean, I didn't want to just, ignore it. I don't have the privilege of ignoring it.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to also just attack them and kind of call, all these white people, they're the problem. They just hate me. They're just all racist. I just didn't want to label them. And so one of the conversations I started to have is I just, started to talk to a lot of my white friends and try to understand why were certain things happening. Why did they have certain ideologies? Why did they have certain different perspectives that I just couldn't relate to or understand? And what I found was that just a lot of them just didn't understand, right? A lot of them just didn't have the information that I had. And, I knew why there was tensions. I knew why, okay, we have a regional conference, we have a state conference, and I knew why we had to have that. But a lot of them didn't understand. They didn't understand the history. They didn't understand the Black experience in America or even in the Christian church. And so from that, after I had that revelation, it was kind of like, okay, what if we made a film that kind of just went through that, talked about the history of Adventism and race relations, talked about kind of what's been going on now, and then also discussing what we should do going forward. So that's kind of the story. That may have been long-winded, but that's kind of the story behind, or the motivation behind doing the documentary, The Wound.
Yeah. And what are some things that you discovered along the way? As you're producing it, like what are some information that people can look forward to kind of, encountering if they watch The Wound? And what did you take away from that particular experience?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest things I took away was the importance of humility and listening. Because even though I'm Black and I'm a Christian and I grew up in this country and I felt like I knew a lot about not only what was the problem, but also how to solve it. Man, I didn't know anything, man. What I had the privilege of doing, I had the privilege of interviewing various different experts on the topic, both Black and white. I tried to spend a lot of time speaking with experts on this area who are Black. I went to Oakwood and talked to a lot of great people. I could go down the list, but I don't have that type of time. But it was just so inspiring to learn about. So sometimes we feel like we have to reinvent the wheel. Like, these are new issues. We have to figure them out. But it's all been documented. One of the biggest things you learn if you watch the documentary is that these conversations have been going on for a long time, even in the Adventist church. And there's a lot of wrong, there's a lot of wounds that have been made. And the biggest reason why we have the tension today is simply because we've always had the tension. There's nothing new has happened today. We've always had these tensions. And so I think the biggest thing that I took from doing the project is the importance of me spending the time to intentionally learn the history, learn from other people, their perspective, even other Black people. There's Black people on our monolith. Like there's a lot of other Black people who feel differently than I do about this topic, right? And so it was such a privilege to be able to learn from other communities, both Black and white, about what has happened and what we need to do going forward. So I think the biggest thing I took away was the importance of listening and having that conversation and not, being too prideful in having that conversation.
And for those who are listening and kind of wanting to know, what does it mean for you to be both Black and Christian in America? How do you navigate those two tensions, especially we live in a country right now that's very politically divided, even racially divided with the current administration. And yet we're still called to be brothers with those who think very differently than us. So can you walk me through, in your own experience, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, man, that's such a good question. I don't. So in my own experience, it's been a struggle. If I've the me in the documentary 2 years ago, even that person is a different person today. And I feel like in the last 4 years, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it does mean to be Black and Christian. And there's been times that, it's such a complex space to be in that there's been times that I'll get really bitter. I remember when the election happened in 2016. I spent a few months just being really bitter towards a certain group of people. That just was reality, and there was times where I, just want to give up on the human race, right? Not even having forgiveness, just give up and just kind of stay in my own circle. And so, I think that what it means for me right now, being Black and being a Christian, for me is I've just had to come to the point where I just surrender to Christ and allow him to help lead me in all my interactions and all my conversations. Because I don't think there's a black and white way to handle this, right? There's some people, I have some white friends who voted for Trump, for example. And this, not to get political, but this is just something in my life. Yeah. And I'll have conversations with them. And, they'll start off saying oh, I don't get Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have a healthy conversation. And by the end of that conversation, they're like, dude, I completely hear what you're saying. This is great. Now I have a better understanding. Let's move forward. And that's really exciting. But then I have other conversations with people and have the same type of approach where they don't end that way. And so as far as how does, and I remember when I was even a student, I would have other peers and even younger students who would come to me and say, hey, dude, how do we navigate this, right? How do we become Christian? How do we behave as Christians, be loving and caring and be slow to anger, all those good jazz, but also be able to put up with the injustice that happens to our community. How do we do that? And I think that recently, just to bring it to something recent, you see the case of, what was the police officer, the female police officer, the Amber Geiger, I believe her name was. After she was found guilty and she was sentenced, the family, not all the family, but the brother of the young man who was killed, he went on the stand, and one of his final statements was hey, it's because I'm a Christian, I want to forgive, Amber, and I want to hug her, and I want to, I just want to let her know that God loves her, right? But what's so fascinating about that is I believe her mother and there's some other people in the family that didn't feel that type of way, right? And there was a lot of people in the Black community. It was a big conversation we had. It was oh man, we're Christians, but but she should serve more time because there's other people that, and it was just a really difficult conversation to have. And so I don't, to answer your question, I don't know if there's one way that a Black Christian looks in 2019, if that makes any sense. Yeah. And I think it's a really challenging topic, and I feel like we're all still trying to figure out how to navigate that.
Well, I appreciate, the work that you're doing and trying to create spaces for these conversations to happen, to kind of dive into the research and just even sharing your own experience, because I think people hearing this, whether you're white or Black or of other minority groups, to really understand that these are tensions that are happening, and that everyone's kind of, if you're a woman and a Christian, or if you're a Black woman and a Christian, or if, what does it mean to hold those two tensions in a society that is not, the New Jerusalem? Stay tuned for next week as we explore the Trinity and the development of Trinitarian theology throughout the history of the Church. We'll also provide some book recommendations if you'd like to further your study on the topic. Thanks once again to the Adventist Learning Community for making this program possible, and thank you for taking the time to listen in. If you have any questions or comments about today's program, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at AdventNext. See you next week.